Time for another edition of Dashing Dan's Sporting Adventures for KISS Professional Solutions, 1300 KISS PS 547777, or on their website www.kissps.com.au. They're the largest independent provider of copiers and printers in Victoria. My name's Dan Lonergan, and with me are the walking sporting encyclopedias and anything you want to know in Damian Watson and Darren Parkin. Welcome, gentlemen. It's part 4 of our preview of the AFL season. As injuries continue, we're not that far away by the time this goes to air of the season starting. And Dash, we start with your beloved Saints, and very interested in them again getting on the front foot and offering Finn Callaghan of the Giants 1.7 over 10 years, which I reckon, sorry, 17 million over 10 years, which I reckon is way too much for a player of that ability. Even though he's a good player, he hasn't really proven himself yet.
Yeah, it's interesting, this, and not trying not to put the hat on, but obviously there's been links around a number of players. There was the Zach Merritt stuff at the end of last season where there was suggestions that St Kilda had asked a question. Obviously the Tom de Koning stuff with the reported sizable offer, although Carlton have put 7 in front of him, and you'd think he'll probably take that and stay. The Luke Davis-Uniacke at North Melbourne, and Andy Brayshaw over at Freo, and a couple of others that have been mentioned in that ilk. The one thing I found interesting in this one was they said a verbal offer in regards to that. So a verbal offer, technically not a contract offer. So I wonder whether it was a case that St Kilda spoke to his management saying, look, we know he barracked for the Saints when he was young. We know he's a Sandringham boy. Does he want to come home, and what would it take? And they said a lot. And St Kilda said, well, how about this much over this much? And they said, no, he's staying put. I get the feeling this one didn't progress too much further. And look, the headlines are going to keep happening, and it obviously unfortunately paints that cycle for St Kilda that they're throwing the net at a lot of people and not landing anybody. But I wonder how serious the offer actually was. But it's not a good headline. I must admit, as a Saints fan, it annoys me when it's constantly, another huge offer rejected. I'm like, how serious was the offer? How far down the road did it get? Like the Zach Merritt one, I think, was a 5-minute conversation with a manager saying, oh, we heard he's in the shits. Any chance he'd go play for St Kilda? And they said no, and that was the limit of it. So that's not an offer. And I just wonder how far this one went, to be honest.
So you're saying that the journalist, Tom Morris, might have got a bit too excited about it?
Not necessarily. Like, I think he would have, there would have been conversations had, and Tom's worked at the Saints, and, he's well connected within the game. But yeah, I think it probably depends on, how long's a piece of string, how serious was the conversation, how serious was the offer. I get the feeling it was on the lesser end of the scale.
Damian, just on that, I mean, there are people that you see on websites, and of course they are the keyboard warriors, saying, well, this guy followed our team, so they should come back. Now, there's big talk that Zach Butters, there's a deal already on the table for him to come to the Bulldogs, being a Bulldog supporter, when his current contract at Port Adelaide runs out at the end of 2026. I've heard from a few people that it's a done deal. Now, I won't believe that until he's actually wearing a Western Bulldogs training top and he's training at the club. But there seems to be a lot of that, because you followed Collingwood, and a lot of people follow Collingwood, you've got to play for Collingwood, or you've got to play for the Bulldogs, or you've got to play for St Kilda. I mean, it's just talk, isn't it?
Brendan Goddard principle, Damo, where he obviously Carlton had pick 1, lost pick 1. He went to the Saints, but because he'd been a lifelong Blues fan for 15 years, it was when will he play for Carlton?
Yeah, I remember those conversations.
I think they lose that pretty quickly, yeah.
Yeah, but then again, I mean, you look at the situation he was in at the time, Dash, where ultimately he was in a side that was building, and I think, I don't think realistically that's a major drawing point. I think the financial element is more influential for me, because these players are eventually going to retire. They want to make as much money out of the game as they can. I think that's much more of a weighted factor rather than the sentimental aspect of, I barracked for this team as a kid. I think we're beyond that element to a great degree, unless you're an absolute nuffy or something when you're young.
Well, that's right. I mean, there are a few players that if they're fringe players, they get the opportunity to go back and play for the team that they were with. I mean, you look at GWS, who had that much talent. Will Hoskin Elliott was a Collingwood supporter, and he was able to go back to Collingwood because he was superfluous for needs for GWS.
To say where I think it's more likely, where it's an extreme move. So I don't think they'd go from, say, one Melbourne club to another Melbourne club or from Adelaide to Port. I think it would be, they're playing for the Eagles, but they grew up in Geelong, so they might go back to Geelong, or they're from South Australia, or in Zach Butter's case, that might be a factor coming back to Victoria rather than staying there. I don't think you'd ever see, for example, someone play for Hawthorn who barracks for Richmond and then go to Richmond. I think it needs to be a more substantial move, like they're from Perth and they'll go and play for the Eagles.
Yeah, the family factor as well is going to be taken into consideration.
It was interesting. Jared Healy said the other day he is not madly in love with this go-home factor. He thinks it's a load of rubbish. He thinks, again, as you guys are saying, it was just his opinion, that it's more about the money. I mean, the go-home factor might be a minor aspect of it. They make it bigger than it is, and some say that it's become another form of mental health fragility amongst players. But it's more about if you get a great offer financially, you will go back to your home state.
My issue with the go home factor is picking a club. So I think if you want to go home, you want to go home. So that's the factor. So if you're from Perth and you're playing in Melbourne and you want to go home, then your club should be able to negotiate with West Coast and Fremantle. I don't think there should be conditions on the go home factor where it's like, I want to go home, but I must play for the Eagles. It's like, well, no, like, if you're homesick, you're homesick, and they play at the same ground. So, yeah, that's kind of how I see that argument.
What about you, Damian? Same view?
I do wonder if there's an underlying in these situations, not going to say it's a selfish factor, but I think there's a factor, particularly with players who play for, say, GWS or the Gold Coast, who show a lot of promise, and Victorian teams or teams from the South can nab them. I think the player themselves think, well, you do get forgotten about, even though GWS are probably going to challenge for the flag this year. A lot of the players, marketability-wise, simply don't stand out to a great degree, aside from the odd outlier like Toby Green or Jeremy Cameron. But even when Cameron was up there, I felt he probably deserved more publicity than he got, given what he was able to produce. And I do think there's that element of players feel they'll be more marketable and can obviously gain a lot more finances, but also there's the marketability side as well, where they get endorsements, etc., if they play for a higher profile club or in a higher profile footy state. So particularly, when you play for GWS and the Gold Coast, the reality is they don't get a heck of a lot of publicity. So I think that comes into it as well. The prospect of playing in front of big crowds too, that I think that is a little bit of a weighted factor too.
It's a bit better for the Gold Coast now with their academy. I mean, I saw Jed Walter last week. It was only match simulation, but if he was a Victorian player, the 10 Victorian clubs, even the Bulldogs, have got lots of key position players, they'd be queuing up for him because I think he's going to be an absolute beauty. But the fact he's from the Gold Coast, I think they're going to have him for his entire career. And I think Dash, he's going to be something very, very special. I know, again, it was just a short sample the other night, or a small sample, but what I saw, I loved.
Yeah, and look, that's obviously homegrown talent's particularly important for those states that don't have a lot of it, those non-football states. But yeah, obviously the academy conversation is one that's always relatively heated when it comes to footy. So, but yeah, I'm not sure the Gold Coast have benefited from that as much as, say, Sydney has historically.
Well, let's get into it. 4 teams to look at: St Kilda, Sydney, West Coast and the Western Bulldogs. All fascinating watches here for KISS Professional Solutions, dashing down sporting adventures. G'day to John McEncrow and the team. They're based, of course, in Carrum Downs, whether they're a large or small business in Melbourne City, Gippsland, Shepparton and Albury, who will also cater for businesses in Wagga. They offer business phone systems, NBN services, CCTV and security systems. All right, the Saints been described by Champion Data as the quickest team in regard to ball movement. Dash, how much is that going to help them this year? And Ross Lyon's been on the front foot. He's been a bit critical of allowing contracted players to go. I think he's a bit frustrated. I think he knows that the pressure is well and truly on him this year.
Yeah, it's interesting. Obviously, the perception that they punched above their weight a bit in 2023, and that may have been validated by what happened in 2024. A lot of people look at various factors of the season, and look, Champion Data were correct in that assessment, but a lot of it was to do with the final piece of play breaking down. So, yeah, the quickest ball-moving side in the competition. They ranked third for playing on from mark, sixth for turning a defensive 50 possession into an inside 50, fourth for time taken to move the ball from defensive 50 to attacking 50, and fifth for coast-to-coast scores. However, that last possession inside 50 has been the issue for them for quite some time. I mean, they've had a top 4 defence 2 years in a row, so ranked number 1 in 2023, ranked number 4 in 2024, but have been ranked bottom 4 for scoring in each of those 2 seasons and in the seasons prior. So I guess in defence of Ross Lyon, they were a bottom 4 scoring side in the 3 years before that as well, or the 2 years before that rather. 2020 was an exception in the unusual COVID year. Obviously last year they went 3-8 in their first 11 games and came home 8-4. But I guess pleasingly in the 8-4, they beat Sydney, who played in the grand final. They beat Geelong, who played in the prelim. They lost to Port Adelaide by 2 points, who played in the prelim. Beat Carlton, who made the 8. Beat Essendon, who were playing for a spot in the 8. Got thumped by Brisbane, and that was probably the low light in the back end of the season for them. But I think pleasingly their form was stacking up okay against reasonable opposition. But yeah, the thing for them is losing Josh Battle, losing a bit of experience forward with Tim Membry. Do they find enough avenues to goal or enough improvement? It was pointed at the fact that they lost games last year by 1, 2, 4, 5, 8 and 10. But I would argue that only the Essendon game in round 3 was a game they probably should have won out of that group. They were probably outplayed in the majority of the other ones. Maybe Port Adelaide late in the year, they probably could have got them. But the others, they were a little bit, they were sort of hanging in there more than anything. I mean, the Giants game, they were 40 points down at three-quarter time and lost by a point. That type of thing. So I think there is some natural improvement on their list. There are mitigating factors in it. I think they defend well enough that they're going to be ultra competitive. So I don't see a regression like some people have spoken about, Damo. I'm not saying they'll explode and improve forward, but a lot of people saying they automatically drop into the bottom 4. I don't get that read on them.
No.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? As we know, Dan, they've had a fair amount of injuries over the off-season, so I wonder how much of an impact that has in the early part of the season. And as you mentioned, Dash, they didn't necessarily have the best start, did they, last year? And could have easily just had the 2 wins in that run that you suggested, because they were probably lucky to beat Richmond. They looked gone at half-time in that Gabba round game, you might remember.
Yeah.
And managed to fight their way back when they struggled to get the ball forward. And I think there's still a lot of scope for development, I think, in their forward half. I think you got promise in the likes of Caminiti, Owens, who's worked his way up through the Sandringham side, Cooper Sharman, who hasn't. I think there's been times where you could make a case he could have more time on the park in the AFL side. He's a good floating mark and can drop down and kick a goal as well. King, as we know, shows a lot of talent. I do wonder about the depth of their midfield to a degree. You might disagree with that. I know McRae comes into a bit of a tallish midfielder role. You got Steele, Hill of Wood, but I don't know about, say, Higgins, Henry, Dow, Clark, and I know Dow has had a recent knee injury as well, whether they're absolute A-grade midfielders. So I don't know, Dash and Dan. I'll start with you, Dash, given you're a Saints supporter. Do you think that there's more depth to be gained in the midfield? And maybe did they draft well? I know they've got a few tallish defenders out of the draft, like Travalia, etc., and Ford.
Yeah, that's the Achilles heel has certainly been midfield. When they lost the elimination final to the Giants in 2023. They got monstered on the ball by that group. And then that Brisbane game we spoke about where they got flogged in the second half of the year when the Lions were the benchmark for form at that stage. I think they didn't win a centre clearance until early in the third quarter. It was pretty messy throughout that game. And, their midfield, they've got some blue-collar guys like Jack Steele. Obviously, McRae is going to be useful as a good ball user who gets a stack of it, and he looked promising in their first practice match against Carlton last week. But, yeah, in terms of kids, it comes down to Filippo, who's unfortunately injured, Liam Henry, who will miss the start of the season but can give them a little bit. Windhager can tag, but do they release him? And look, a couple of kids who haven't played AFL, so they're a long way off the mark. But Travalia, kicked the sealer the other day. Certainly Boxall, who they recruited from WA, looks pretty lively. O'Connell, the Irishman, close to BOG in that game on the weekend. So they've just got to hope they find one or two of those players, or they turn one of them into a halfback like Travalia, release Sinclair into the middle to give them a bit more polish and experience in there. But no doubt it's an Achilles heel as their midfield.
Well, McRae, of course, is one of their ends. I think it'd be a handy acquisition, but he's not quick. You're right, he is a great ball gatherer and he'll go back to doing what he's always done. Travali, you mentioned, Saru, you mentioned top 10 draft picks. Battle is gone. Campbell's gone as well. Worry a little bit about the defence. Obviously, Wilkie's a star. Is he going to have enough support down there with Cordy and Howard? Are they good enough? You play Caminiti down there, or you play him in the forward line. Look, I don't think they'll make the 8, but I don't think, as Dash said, they'll drop as much as some are thinking they will. I think they'll be around the 9th, 10th, 11th mark, win 10 or 11 games. I just don't think they score enough, but I think because of Ross Lyon being Ross Lyon, if things are getting grim again like they did in the West Coast game where he just decided Harley Reid's on top here, we're going to go back, we're going to completely close it down, and they got a good win, and I think their season sort of changed a bit after that. I think if that happens, he will do that again, but I still don't think they've got enough talent to make the top 8. What do you think? And Damian, you don't think they can make the 8, but you think they can be thereabouts, sort of? Almost 50-50 wins or just under, a bit like me?
Probably just under. I'm thinking around the 11th or 12th mark. And I'll be interested to see, Dash, whether Ari Schoenmaker gets more of a go as well. I thought he showed a bit of promise in the back half of last season, particularly in the last 4 games. I guess he was a bit of a draft steal because I think there were questions regarding his discipline as a kid in Tasmania. But, gee, he's got a great shoe on him. He can pump the ball 60 metres quite comfortably for a young fella.
It was surprising on the weekend when St Kilda had probably 10 or 11 first-choice players out that he played in the Sandringham practice match, which was the second leg of that doubleheader. So, and they're a bit undersized in defence. Dougal Howard is still out with the shoulder that he injured in a match sim a few weeks ago. So you had Wilkie and Cordy. The young kid, Taru, who can play at both ends, is also recovering from some postseason surgery, I think, on his back. So he'll take a little bit of time. I think Boyd, the boy they recruited from South Australia, the mature-aged ruckman, how he goes will be interesting because he looked pretty good against Carlton, and what that could do is allow them to move Marshall, say, 50-50 forward, which would then allow them to play Caminiti back. At the moment, they're probably going to play Caminiti forward and Marshall ruck, but Boyd could give them a bit more flexibility in that space. So, yeah, look, I'm of that same boat. That look, they're well organised, they're disciplined, they're defensively sound, which means they'll win roughly half their games like they've done over most of recent years. But they do need to find a cleaner avenue to goal inside 50 if they are to turn, say, 10 wins into 13 and play finals again. So until they do that, it's obviously hard to predict.
And a couple more questions on the Saints. What do you think Max King will do this year? And are you worried about his body? And if we were picking the Saints, there's a lot of people are starting to do now. We're halfway through, a quarter of the way through this century, picking St Kilda's best team of this century. Do you have Wilkie in that? I certainly wouldn't. I think he's one of the great steals, recruiting-wise, in the history of the game, certainly this century anyway.
Yeah, I mean, St Kilda's defence, if you looked at this century, you'd have Max Hutchison, you would have Sam Fisher, then you'd go with Wilkie. Who did you say, Damo?
Would Pickett fit in, do you think, or not?
Potentially as a running option, sort of smaller running option, and then where do you play Aussie Jones in your team? Does he play halfback, flank, or wing? And then, how long do you wait to play Jack Sinclair, or is he, on a halfback flank potentially in that lineup? Sam Gilbert, where does he fit in all of that? But I think Hutchison, Fisher, and Wilkie, I'd be picking as 3 tools in that group, with one of Fisher or Wilkie obviously to be an interceptor and work through it from there. Max King, yeah, look, I mean, there was that scare in the pre-season, and I hope maybe that gives him some confidence because I know he thought he'd done his ACL. Yeah. Maybe if he bounces up, only misses a week or 2, the leg actually stays sturdy under him. Hopefully that gives him the confidence to think, maybe I can endure this and it's not always going to be worst case scenario. So maybe that's a turning point perhaps.
Exactly. So that's St Kilda. Again, they're a fascinating watch. They always are. And who knows under Ross Lyon what they could do this year, and always expect the unexpected with the when I say expect the unexpected, also expect the expected. But they'll be hanging around, but I'm not sure they'll make the 8. But we'll just have to wait and see. They'll be a fascinating watch, as we said. This is Dashing Dan's Sporting Adventures. We're previewing the AFL season. This is part 4 with Dan Lonergan, Darren Parkin, and Damian Watson for KISS Professional Solutions. They take pride in going the extra mile for their customers, aiming to retain them for life. They're the largest independent provider of copiers and printers in Victoria. You can get hold of them on the phone, 1300 KISS PS or 547777. Damian, the Sydney Swans, they've lost Luke Parker. Ryan Clark has gone. He'll be playing for Sorrento in the MPFNL. It's a big pickup for the Sorrento Sharks in the Mornington Peninsula Football Netball League. They haven't really gained any one major except a couple in the draft. Still very worried about their forward line. Those tools of Amati, McDonald, McInerney, McLean. I'm not sure they're consistent enough. We know their midfield's very good, but I wonder whether they overachieved a bit last year.
Well, the other aspect I think to take into account is that they no longer have John Longmire as head coach, and he's been there, as we know, for a long time. And prior to his senior coaching tenure, he was an assistant as well. So having that influence around the group for such a long period of time, whether his departure changes anything in regards to game style, in regards to just having that influence as well, I do wonder whether that has some sort of impact as well. I know Dean Cox ultimately has been sitting under the learning tree, shall we say, of John Longmire for a long period of time. So I guess they've created a lot of good apprenticeship roles at the Swans. We saw that when Roos, who was there for a long time, handed the reins over to Longmire. But it's still always different when you change who I guess that the main mentor is from a coaching point of view, because ultimately they make the decision. Just in terms of some of the look, they still have some top line players. I see what you're saying, Dan, but you look at players like Warner, who is only going to get better as well. I mean, he's only 23 years of age, Chad Warner. So I think if he continues on his trajectory in regards to developing his skills and also his discipline, he can be an elite player. They've still got Tom Papley there. So I still think they'll be competitive, but I'm not sure if they'll be a grand final side necessarily, but you can never really rule out the Swans. I mean, how often over the years have they bottomed out? Very rarely over the last 20 years in particular. So I still think they'll be around the mark. They've got some elite players in there.
Dash, it's interesting because they just flew out of the blocks last year, dominated the first half of the season. And as quickly as they dominated the first half of the season, they flatlined a lot in the second half of the season. And it sort of came from nowhere a bit, didn't it?
Yeah, they won 10 in a row at one stage in the year, as you say, early, and then lost 5 of their next 6 before they then won 5 in a row heading into the grand final. But there are a few things of concern, I guess, statistically through all of that. I mean, one, Damo mentioned the transition into Dean Cox. I wonder whether that helps their mental recovery from the grand final, because obviously John Longmire would have carried the same baggage that they were carrying. You know, they've lost their last 4 grand finals, 14, 16, 22 and 24, but have lost by 63, 84 and 60 in 3 of those games. Obviously the Bulldogs one was a bit closer than that, but if you look at that back end of the year, they lost by 112, I think, to Port Adelaide. No side's won a flag after losing a game by 100 points in a season since Carlton in 1945. So that's how far back you have to go. And they got outplayed in that first final for the most part by the Giants. They obviously managed to get over the top in the last quarter, but they were getting outplayed in that game. They then beat Port, who were a bit banged up, I guess, by this time the prelim came around. But last year, 2023, they were ranked 8th defensively and finished 8th on the table. 2024, they were ranked 7th defensively and 6th best defensive side in the 8. So we mentioned the stat last week that no sides won the flag ranked outside the top 4 defensively, and they were ranked 7th. So there were I agree with the calls on their forward line that, would the likes of McDonald and Amati be able to stand up in big games, but they could also be scored against. And Brisbane carved them up, as we know, in the grand final with their run and speed. So Sydney have got a lot going for them in terms of their depth in their midfield and the quality that they have all over the park, but I just wonder about maybe the bookends or whether that's a playing style thing. But they, push comes to shove, I think teams can stop them, but they can't stop the top echelon in the real key moments.
With Dean Cox, Damian, I mean, he was an automatic selection as coach. I mean, we're not going to know, are we? It's going to take at least a year to know whether he's the right man to be coach. Do you think just by what you've seen with him as an assistant coach? He knows the system pretty well, that he's going to be a good senior coach?
I think the advantage he's had is that he's been around that group of players for a little while now, so he knows, I guess, the strengths and weaknesses of a lot of that group. And I think that's always an advantage rather than necessarily coming from a different club or coming from a different level. Given that he served that sort of apprenticeship, I think that does help. Having said that, how often have we seen I guess a transition or situation where there has always been someone waiting in the wings, like a Wayne Britton going back when David Parkin took over, the Malthouse Buckley example. It doesn't always come to fruition either. But I think generally it is an advantage to at least get an idea of the flaws and also the strengths of certain players when you're around that group, and about the culture as well. And Sydney have been pretty good at doing that in recent times.
Marco, did you think he was going to be a senior coach when you were watching him play? I thought maybe a ruck coach, but I didn't think he was going to be a senior coach.
It's hard to tell. Yeah, obviously Ruckman, generally speaking, I know there have been some Matthew Primus and various others across the journey that have stepped into that role, but I think it looked semi-likely what was going to happen here when West Coast were looking for a coach through 2024 and Dean Cox was immediately ruled out of the running. You thought, well, the favourite son, he's immediately said no. I don't think that had much to do with West Coast. I think that had much to do with what was already in place. I think had Sydney have won the flag, we probably would have seen it anyway. That would have been a nice full stop for John Longmire. Now it was probably a case that maybe there was just too much to get through and to overcome. So they've done it now. And, I think it's closer. It's not exactly the same as, say, Buckley Malthouse or even Bruce Goodwin, but it is probably similar to Ruse Longmire in a lot of respects. So, I think we'll probably see him go pretty well.
And Damian, Tom McCartan, they're trying him forward. What do they do then with a key defender? They've got Malikan, they've got Rampy, but he does play undersized. They might need to find another key defender. Do they move McLean or McInerney back and just make a swap with McCartan going forward?
Yeah, it does raise a big question. You're right. And Rampy's no spring chicken either, is he? But you mentioned Melican, Robbie Fock, Aaron Francis, maybe a Joel Hamling. If they bunch them together, those are the options. But, I think problem is you sort of rob Peter to pay Paul in that type of scenario, don't you? So it does have an effect on the forward line to a great degree as well if you want to chop and change. Maybe Hayden McLean has a bit of a role change as well. He's got a good pair of hands, Dan and Dash, and he could be a bit of an interceptor if he's allocated that role. But as I said, that might leave them. He's pretty handy up forward as well when he can go down there. So it does lead to a situation where, they have to try and make a compromise between both bookends. So it'll be interesting. I don't think you're going to get a like-for-like replacement necessarily, but they do have a knack, the Swans, of getting the best out of players and changing roles and getting the players to make it work.
I've got them top 8. I don't think that they'll be top 4. So I don't think they can win the premiership, but I'd be surprised if they fell out of the top 8. I think there's enough talent, and I think we've discussed Dean Cox, that there's enough familiarity with him and the players to ensure that they play finals. What do you guys think?
Similar for me. I think I think we'll probably see halfway between the 2023 Swans and the 2024 Swans, where there'll be a top 8 pushing top 6 team. But probably not quite in the mix for the flag. But they're not far away. Obviously, they've played in a grand final, and their midfield is outstanding. But I'd have a couple ahead of them.
Damian?
I still think they have the capacity to make top 4 with their talent there. But I think they could finish anywhere between 2nd and 6th. Really, they're one of those sides that you could never really write off. A bit like Geelong in more recent time. So I'm probably a little less inclined to absolutely write them off. I think they still have, with the talent at their disposal, the capacity to win not saying they're going to win the flag, but I think they have the capacity to challenge still.
So you wouldn't be surprised if they happen to win it?
It wouldn't surprise me, no.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
I wouldn't be stunned, that's for sure. I haven't quite got them there, but if they won the flag, I wouldn't fall over, that's for sure.
Let's not forget, Dan,
Mm.
they had a very, very good start to the season where, they were the benchmark, and maybe complacency set in when they had that run of, that 5-week run when they were pretty poor. Maybe that was a factor as well. Whether they admit that, I'm not sure.
His Professional Solutions are our sponsor for Dashing Down Sporting Adventures, part 4 of our preview of the AFL season. We've looked at St Kilda, we've looked at Sydney, West Coast to come, and then the Western Bulldogs. And KISS Professional Solutions, whatever your office technology needs may be, they're here to provide sound advice, competitive pricing, and unparalleled customer support. You can get them on their website, www.kissps.com.au. West Coast Eagles, Andrew McQualter, the new coach. Adam Simpson is gone. They've picked up Jack Graham. They've picked up Liam Baker. I think that had a lot to do with the fact they knew Andrew McQualter well from his long time as an assistant coach and then interim coach in 2023 at the Tigers. They've also got Allen as a first-round draft pick, and they wanted him. Barras is a big loss going to Hawthorn. Jack Darling, 2 games short of 300, has headed across to North Melbourne. Dash, where do we think West Coast will be this year? Will there be improvement? I think there might be, but I still think they'll be hovering around the bottom 4 at this stage.
Yeah, it's interesting that there was some steady improvement through 2024. If you look at 2022 up until late 2023, they went 3 wins and 36 losses between the start of 2022 and about round 18 of 2023. Last year, they lost 8 matches, or 2023, they lost 8 matches by 70 points or more, including 4 by over 100 points. Since then, they've gone 7 and 22, which is not great, but obviously to go from 3 and 36 to 7 and 22. And in those last 29 games, only 4 times have they lost by more than 70 and not by 100 points in that time. So they stemmed the bleeding, became a little bit more competitive. They started to play a bit better at home. They beat Melbourne. They beat Fremantle in a couple of those good wins in the West. That they were still a little bit vulnerable. Obviously, the last couple of weeks when Carlton and Geelong got hold of them and under strength Carlton in the West. And their other bad loss was to Adelaide, who seemed to get hold of them all the time. So, they were better. Obviously, they had the unsettling factor with Adam Simpson being moving on in the middle of the year, and who will coach them. I think they've recruited pretty well in the off-season. I think their additions from the Tigers will help them. I think we'll see them a lot steadier this year. It was a very un-West Coast-like period in history, sort of 2022, 2023, and maybe they'll get a little bit of their old DNA back.
Damian?
Yeah, it's interesting. Probably when I look at the strength ahead, you could probably separate them into quadrants, can't you? Strengths and weaknesses. I mean, they do have a lot of promise, I think, up forward. That's one thing that could work for them. Waterman had a pretty good year, even though he obviously had to try and overcome the obstacles of illness. Oscar Allen back on the comeback trail after he missed that entire 2023 season. Liam Ryan, they've got Matt Owies, who's a new recruit, who was a bit of a maligned player at Carlton, but he was 3rd, I think, on the goal kicking list last year. So he at least has that knack and ability to try and score majors, even though he can butcher it a little bit. So there is some promise there. We know about Harley Reid. I know the Eagles are wanting to try and secure him long term. I don't know whether they may be able to convince him. I know obviously his partner has got family ties and he's got family ties back here in Victoria. So that'll be an interesting watch going forward. I still think he's got room for improvement in regards to his fitness and his ability to run out games. I'm not suggesting he's lazy or anything like that, but I think fitness is one thing he can still work on because he what I found, great talent, but it tends to be shown spasmodically. So I'll be interested to see whether he can improve in terms of his consistency in regards to output rather than having spasmodic contributions. I think they really need a dominant ruckman, don't they? I mean, since Nick Naitanui retired, they've really struggled to solidify a real dominant ruckman. There's all these rumours about whether they try and lure Tim English, but Bailey Williams tried hard, but hasn't really had that overpowering dominance that you want. Matt Flynn probably hasn't worked. It must be said. He just hasn't been able to play enough football. So, and that's speak of injuries as well. Dom Sheed's not going to play this year. Elliot Yeo is going to miss the start of the season. So, but those are the worries I have for the Eagles.
Well, You've mentioned Matt Owens, of course, he was another inclusion. I couldn't understand why Carlton let him go, but he'll be very handy. Andrew McQualter as coach. Not many guys that are interim coaches at another club get an opportunity. I'm also interested too on the dynamics that Jared Schofield had stayed. He was their interim coach in the back end of last year, and as you mentioned, Parko, those two big losses late in the season to Carlton and Geelong probably didn't help his situation. But it is fascinating that he has elected to stay. Normally, when you're interim coach, you move on, you go somewhere else. McQualter went to Melbourne for a year, and now he's got the gig at West Coast. How do you think he'll go? I mean, there are big raps on him. I know Ross Lyon loves him and wanted him back at St Kilda, Parko. I think he'll be good, but again, it's that Victorian factor that if things don't go well early, the media will pile in on him like they did at Adam Simpson towards the end.
Yeah, it's undeniable. There's a clear pattern that happens. South Australia, WA, it's always been that way, unfortunately. The old Robert Shaw story with his car getting vandalised. But
right.
Yeah, I think it was interesting with Schofield. As you say, I can't think of too many precedents, unless there was an interim coach who didn't want the job long term and made that very clear. It's very unusual that they would stick around. You look recently, Robert Harvey, when he didn't get the job at Collingwood, when Craig McRae got it, he moved on, and a few of those types of instances. Jade Rawlings at Richmond when he was filling in for Plough, I think back in the day. So yeah, it's
maybe no one wanted to sign him.
Maybe, but it's good on him, and if he can make it work. I mean, because the other factor would be Andrew McQualter, whether you'd be worried that you're looking over your shoulder a little bit, but obviously he's got enough confidence in what he's doing to be okay.
Alan McConnell's another one. He had two cracks at Fitzroy, didn't he? Bernie Quinlan, he replaced him in 1995, and then when Mick Noonan replaced him, he was still there. It was a bit different, and Fitzroy were powerless and on their knees, and of course weren't going to be helped by the great, and I put that in inverted commas, Ross Oakley. If Wayne Jackson had been in, as we know, Fitzroy are probably still here as Fitzroy, but that's a story for another day. So
Alan McConnell's a technical answer too, because he ended up coaching GWS in the AFLW. So he is an interim coach who technically did coach at the highest level. So
yeah, he certainly did. So where do we think with West Coast? I mean, I think they can win around 8 games. They need to be looking to win around 8 games if there is to be discernible improvement. But you're right, Damian. Sheed's a massive loss. Yo's body's letting him down again. Their strength is McGovern down back. Their weakness is a reliance, I think, on McGovern. And there was an interesting article, I don't know whether it's been blown out of proportion or not, about Tim Kelly not being as focused as he should have been. Hopefully he's more focused because we know what a good player he is. But I think they can win 8 games. And if they don't improve a bit, I think the pressure, and it would be unfair, will be on Andrew McQualter straight away.
Yeah, I think you're right. 6 games, I reckon they potentially win, and it'll be $1.04 on the market for the West Australian to just go nuts this season on the back page, the newspaper. Dan, I know it's changed a bit since your time in Perth, that newspaper, it's fair to say.
Oh, well, I mean, it has. But it was all about the West Coast Eagles. I mean, Freo, if they have a great year, hopefully they'll get the credit that they deserve. But if West Coast are going well, West Coast will get more credit than Fremantle. That's just the way it is. They've been very good at being seen as the number one sporting team. We've seen it with Trevor Nisbet for years and years and years. When there was issues off the field, he managed to keep the Western Australian media at bay. But, of course, because Adam Simpson was a Victorian, Mick Malthouse being a Victorian wasn't well liked, but he didn't like the media anyway. But Adam Simpson being a Victorian, when things started to go badly, we saw they came for him. So the same thing might happen to Andrew McQualter. But, again, we'll just have to wait and see with the West Coast Eagles. Dashing Down Sporting Adventures, 1300 KISS PS 547777, KISS Professional Solutions, our major sponsors, the largest independent provider of copiers and printers in Victoria. Whether you're a large or small business, they're at Melbourne, Sydney, Gippsland, Shepparton and Albury, and they can also cater for businesses in Wagga. To the Western Bulldogs and their stats of last year. Here we go. Their stats of last year. Parko, as you would know, and according to Champion Data, they were top 4 in most stats, Their defence improved when they got Rory Lobb down as a defender. I still worry about a makeshift of being their best defender early days with Liam Jones injured. They've got a lot of injuries early days. I think their draw at the start's pretty tough. They had a horrible final against Hawthorn, but it might just indicate Hawthorn were too good for them. They are, again, I'll use this phrase, and it's not like the Western Bulldogs to be a fascinating watch because generally they're a club that just slide into the background. But I think of most clubs because of where Luke Beveridge is, not having a contract, they are a fascinating watch, I reckon, gentlemen, in 2025, not just because they're my team.
Yeah, I'll go with the stats that you mentioned. So they were ranked second offensively over the entire season. They were ranked number one for defence. They conceded the fewest number of inside 50s of any team in the competition over the year, ranked fourth for clearances, fifth for inside 50s themselves. 116 goals between their three key forwards, two of them obviously very young. You look at Darcy in particular, who could be anything. He's already had a 7-goal game at AFL level. And obviously there's questions over what sort of the future might look like for Jamari Ugle-Hagan, but we know Norton, obviously an impressive talent, and English in the ruck. So the numbers profiled with a side that could win the flag. We knew that when they played Hawthorn in the elimination final that it was an unfortunate matchup because you had two sides that were absolutely airborne and you had to lose one of them. They were very much outgunned in that game around the ball. They didn't play particularly well. I think they're better than that. But yeah, towards the end of the season and even early in the year, they arrested a bit of a trend where if they had bad days, they were quite bad. If you looked at their numbers at the start of the year, when they won matches, they were winning by 14 goals. And when they lost matches, they were losing by 8 points and things like that. They were hanging in there in their bad days and they were pretty strong in their good days. So all of that profile suggests that they're going okay. They failed to capitalise on chances. Obviously, they haven't finished top four in the Luke Beveridge era, which would surprise a few people given they've made 2 grand finals and won a flag. But they've often had a top four list in most people's eyes. They're the 5th worst side in the comp for accuracy in front of goal and were the 2nd worst in the comp after round 16. And I mentioned their ability to stay tight in matches early in the year. They lost a bit of that late in the year. They went 8-4 after the bye, but their 4 losses were 43, 38, 39, 37. So between 6 and 7 goals on average. So in conclusion, I think the Bulldogs have all the tools, Dan, to be very, very good. It's probably just that consistency or whether they can get it all together at the right time, but they've got enough weapons, so they should be playing finals at the very least.
Well, Damian, they've got match winners on every line. They've lost a little bit of depth. I'm still disappointed they lost Caleb Daniel and to a lesser extent Jack McRae. They were always going to lose Bailey Smith as soon as he did his knee. He was disengaged. It would have been interesting what sort of year he could have had last year of a contract and how engaged he would have been knowing he still wanted to go to Geelong if he didn't get injured. That didn't happen, so we're never going to know. But yeah, Jamari Ugle-Hagan is the one, isn't he? I mean, I'm hearing from people within the club that he wants to play round 1. Now, that would be unbelievable and mind-boggling if he did because he's hardly got a pre-season under his belt, and I think it would be a massive risk. And I still worry a little bit down back at this stage outside, as I mentioned, Rory Lobb, that have they got enough talent to stop the big guns of the opposition? And I worry about their outside run. Is there enough of that? But having said that, they've got the talent, but I don't think it's a top, with great respect, Ash, top 5 talent-wise. I think it might just sneak in for top 8, but there is enough talent there. What do you think, Damian?
Sort of a momentum. They're a momentum-based team, aren't they? They're an odd team to watch. I find them one of the great ponderies, the Western Bulldogs, because you never know. They could just pull something out of the fire and smash very good opposition, or they can absolutely, real Jekyll and Hyde side, they can absolutely play a stinker in a game that they should win. So they're really, really difficult to predict. And how many times have we thought, well, Luke Beveridge is gone? You know, it seems like there's ruptures within the camp and they're not playing all that well. And then he seems to turn things around. Having said that, we probably should mention that talent is good enough. The talent within their list is good enough to be a very genuine top 4 contender. So maybe we get fooled by the downward trends that they have and then he worked back up at the right time. I'm not sure. It'd be interesting. I mean, even with Rory Lobb, you mentioned, he looked gone, didn't he? 12 months ago, his career looked shot. he was, taking little jibes on Instagram saying he had to play in the VFL and things like that. And he's resurrected himself with a new role. Even Riley West, a player who wasn't getting enough of a stable go, did turn things around a bit when he got more opportunity and there was a bit of faith put in him and could actually go down and score a goal as well as having a disposal-wise in the middle. So, I guess my point is I wouldn't rule the Bulldogs out necessarily on challenging some of the best sides. But it's just so hard to predict what they throw up.
I think Treloar and Waitman, guys, are massive losses. Treloar had an outstanding year last year, and Waitman gone because he's a bit of an X factor. I mean, if they've only got the two tall forwards for a while, if Jamara's not there, as we think he won't be for a little while, and it's Darcy and Norton, two pretty good players, as you mentioned, Dash, he can nearly play as a third tall forward with his ability to fly and crash packs. But he's not there for the first half of the year. So who sort of replaces him? I think Arthur Jones, Vandermeer, just, even though Beveridge loves him. Also Scott and McNeil. I don't think they're certainly not in the class of Waitman. So they fall away a little bit with depth. But the interesting thing is, Parko, under Luke Beveridge, the Bulldogs have only had one losing year, and that was 2018. 8 wins, 14 losses. 2017 was 11 and 11. They've won 130 and lost 100 under him. So he knows how to win games, but he also knows how to experiment at the wrong time. This year, do you guys think that because he hasn't re-signed or a new contract hasn't been offered to him, that he just coaches, forgets about trying to experiment and think that he's the greatest coach since sliced bread? Just go out and coach with the team you've got. What do you think about that?
That's often been the criticism from Bulldogs fans, yourself and others that I've spoken to, is that they can get a bit inventive with selection or inventive with style and things like that. As you say, fundamentally, they keep delivering, but obviously they've had to do it the hard way in both their grand final years. The flag year, they did it from 7th, and the grand final year, they did it from 5th, and they were on top of the ladder, I think, with a month to go before the end of the season that year and lost their way a bit in that back end and nearly pinched it anyway. But yeah, I think sometimes, because the Bulldogs have had quite a bit of depth, but I think sometimes not knowing what your best 22 is a bad thing, because you're constantly throwing magnets around and maybe they've just got a little bit too inventive, as you say. So, yeah, I wonder whether he changes that mindset a little bit and realises that he might perhaps be onto something. But, yeah, time will ultimately judge.
And do you think Damian, and you know more about these two players than most of us, Darren has probably seen them play a little bit, should have they picked one of Crosley or Brew up? I couldn't understand why they didn't. I heard Brew got injured and that put him back a bit in the pre-season, and Crosley hadn't had enough of a pre-season, but that's not his fault. He was asked to come on the list and play a couple of match simulation type matches, and had been training with Southport, where, of course, it's a different pre-season compared to the AFL. So I thought that they should have picked at least one of them up.
Yeah, they're probably a bit stiff. They probably weren't given all that much of an opportunity, really, Dan, for the reasons you mentioned. So it was almost a bit of a fleeting type of event, wasn't it, for both of them? I do feel for someone like Don Brew. He's absolutely desperate to try and get into the AFL system. You can hear it in his voice. He's a very passionate sort of player, but an under player as well. It's interesting. It's a good point you make in regards to some of these players. I think we're up to, I just saw a stat from Brendan Rhodes where we've had 18 players picked up by an AFL club and actually given a spot on the list from the VFL as a bit of a supplementary player in the last 18 months. So whether it becomes maybe the Sean Manor effect comes into it, where we see more of this going forward, it'll be interesting. So I don't know whether Crosley gets another chance. There's age that has to be taken into account as well. But I wouldn't lose hope if I were them necessarily. But look, maybe they just did it to pop things up, given how fleeting the experience was for them.
So do the Bulldogs make the 8?
They should, yeah. I think they'd be pretty disappointed if they didn't. I think, if we look at Fremantle as having missed the finals in a year they really shouldn't have missed the finals, I think it would be that type of scenario for the Bulldogs with what they have at the moment.
I think they're 1 and 4 early. I think they're 4 and 7 halfway, but they storm home and maybe just make it. But it'll depend what the narrative is, Damian, regarding the coach, if they're 4-7 at the halfway mark, whether they've decided, no, that's it, we're not going to offer you a new contract. And then obviously if they replace him with a new coach, then things might really lose their way. But I think they can make it, but I don't expect them to do a lot of damage, no. What do you think, Damian?
I think they'll finish just outside the top four. We've heard those murmurings about Beveridge before, though, haven't they? Where they've been in a situation, an awkward situation mid-season, and then he turns things around. It's interesting. I can't think of too many coaches over the journey that have delivered a premiership that caused so much joy that has been so maligned by his own supporter base. He's an absolute outlier.
Actually reckon the closest to that, and it's not the same, but the closest to that is actually Simon Goodwin, to be honest.
Yeah, true. But there's extenuating circumstances around that because the questions surrounding Goodwin relate to the culture of the club, maybe a little bit of infighting that we've seen over the journey as well. Whereas I think around Beveridge, it's probably more the man-to-man relationship that he has with his players in a football sense and the tactical side of things as well. That's where he comes under fire.
But but he loses players every year, as you say, Damian. I mean, Daniel and McQualter gone because they weren't played. I still can't understand why they didn't play Daniel. I think Daniel have a great year for North Melbourne this year, and there'll be nightmares for Bulldog supporters. And every year he's lost players because I don't know what happens to the relationship. And they talk about him being a great motivator. I certainly don't think he's a great coach strategically like a Ross Lyon or a Sam Mitchell who are head and shoulders above any other coach in the comp in that area. But so if he's a great motivator, he's got great relationships, why is he losing players every single year? And just on that, I'd love to get your top 8 before we go. If some of the players who are the fringe players for the Bulldogs can go okay in the middle, such as a Matthew Kennedy, such as a James Harmes, and Jamara's missing for a large portion of the season, do you put the great man, number 4, forward for a few matches? Bontempelli?
Maybe. Yeah, I think certainly, back into his career, he's got that capabilities. I mean, we look at what Fremantle might do with Fife and those sorts of things. I mean, he's still got a lot of elite midfield time to come. But yeah, I would be very tempted to dabble in that path for sure.
Damian, the greatest Bulldog you reckon we've ever seen?
Well, it's a good question. He'd have to be right up there, wouldn't he? Given his versatility. I know Chris Grant was a champion for many years. We know about Charlie Sutton.
Teddy Whitten.
Yeah, as far as Teddy Whitten, but the athletic gazelle-like motions of Marcus Bontempelli, I don't know if any Bulldog has matched that over the years. He'd have to be up there, wouldn't he? I'd rate him as number 1. Why not?
And Dash, you brought up a good point before about Goodwin. And obviously Melbourne supporters are not 100% in love with him, even though he's delivered their first flag since 1964. And the same with Beveridge. Why do you think that is with those struggling clubs, that even though they've finally tasted the Holy Grail after so many years, are they expecting them not to go well? Or is that because of the culture of mediocrity that has permeated those clubs for a long time? I mean, if Ross Lyon was to deliver St Kilda's second premiership, how do you think he'd be seen by St Kilda supporters? A bit differently?
I'd single-handedly sculpt Ross Lyon's statue if he won the flag. I'd build it myself. Yeah, look, it's, to be honest, I've wrestled with that question a lot. It's not a mindset I can fully understand. I mean, St Kilda are a comparable club to the Bulldogs in Melbourne in the last 50 years in terms of success. Obviously, Melbourne were a powerhouse back in the day, but I can't, and I've asked fans those questions, and they'll say, "Oh, look, I just don't see it, or I don't have that confidence or that faith, or all the reasons we've mentioned here, tactically, relationships, and I don't know. Maybe if St Kilda ever won a flag, maybe in the 2 or 3 years that followed, I might get a grasp of what that feels like. But I can't comprehend it. I'd think that you would almost be able to write your own contract in terms of how long you want to stay, to be honest.
Yeah, but they said the same thing, Dan, about Lee Matthews when he broke through for that that drought-breaking premiership in 1990. Alan McAllister famously said, "You got a job for life," and
Correct.
we all know what happened in 1995. He was the man who was responsible for his departure. But I think it comes down to the individuals involved. I mean, you look at the Bulldogs, for example, Dan. Terry Wallace, although it was an acrimonious finish, he tended to have a lot of respect and love from the Bulldog supporter base. Even Rodney Eade, who's a bit of a character that could be received both ways, I didn't feel the same maligned sort of reception towards him than we see with Beveridge. So it's an interesting one, isn't it?
Oh, it certainly is. It certainly is. It is fascinating. But look, it's going to be another wonderful year. I think it'll be a very tight year. So before we let you go, boys, on Dashing Dan's sporting adventures for KISS Professional Solutions, 1300 KISS PS 547777, your top 8.
Dame, I'll let you go first.
Yep.
I'm just finalising the positions on mine. I've moved a couple.
All right. So I've got GWS on top, Brisbane in second. I reckon Sydney to finish third. I would say Hawthorn fourth, Geelong fifth, Bulldogs sixth, Carlton seventh, and maybe Collingwood to sneak into the 8th. And I have Fremantle ninth.
No, Port Adelaide.
No, I suppose maybe I could fit them in there somewhere. It was on the fly. I apologise.
I'm the same. I'm actually the same. I've gone
Really?
Giants on. Yeah, I've gone Giants on only because there's too many sides to squeeze in. I've got Giants on top, Hawthorn second, Brisbane third, your mob, the Doggies, in fourth, Sydney fifth, Collingwood sixth, Carlton seventh, and Fremantle making the 8th. So I have Geelong, Melbourne, and Port all missing.
Geelong missing.
Again, it's a tough call. Like they could replace literally any of those 8, so it's no doubt.
Well, I've gone Hawthorn to win it, GWS second, Brisbane third, Geelong fourth, Collingwood 5th. It's time for the Gold Coast. I've got them 6th. Sydney 7th, and Carlton just getting in ahead of the Western Bulldogs 8th. Fremantle, I know we said that they've really got to make the 8th, but I just can't see them making it ahead of these other sides, and it might be it for Justin Longmuir, and I've got them 10th and Port Adelaide 11th, and write a ticket on the rest. So
will it be the end of Beveridge then?
I think so. Beveridge? Yeah, I think so. I think they've got a tough start. I mean, their first 5, North Melbourne, you think they'd win that. Collingwood tough, Carlton tough, Fremantle in Perth tough, Brisbane, I know it's in Melbourne, but that won't be easy either. I think they can be 1 and 4. When you consider they won't have Liam Jones, they probably won't have Treloar. They certainly won't have, I don't think, Jamari Ugle-Hagan, and they won't have Waitman. There's 4 pretty good players out of the side. Richards, I believe, will be okay. He's just got calf soreness. So I think, I think that'll be the end of Luke Beveridge, and who replaces him will be another.
I reckon somewhere between 14 and 16 teams can make the 8. So I reckon it's that even a comp. So I reckon, obviously, Richmond, you'd think would be unlikely to make it. And then, if you pick a couple of... Look, I think North and West Coast will both improve, but I don't think they'll improve enough to make the 8. But I think they'll improve. So there's what... That leaves 15. It depends if you can chip anyone out of that 15. I'm not entirely sold on Essendon's chances of making it, but I don't think you can eliminate too many more.
I mean, Essendon to me haven't got a bad side, but they just don't perform well enough. Still worry about their defence, as we've spoken about. So
I wouldn't entirely put a line through them either. Like the way they start season. So I'm almost sitting at 15 sides can make the 8.
Yeah, well, that's why it's a great competition, boys, isn't it? I appreciate your time. Great to have Darren Parkin and Damian Watson, 2 of the great sporting encyclopedias in the history of sport. 2 wonderful broadcasters as well, joining me, Dashing Dan, on Dashing Dan's sporting adventures for KISS Professional Solutions. They're the largest independent provider of copiers and printers in Victoria. They're based in Carrum Downs in Melbourne. But whether you're a large or small business in Melbourne, Sydney, Gippsland, Shepparton and Albury that will cater for businesses in Wagga, they offer business phone systems, NBN services, CCTV and security systems. G'day to John McEncrow and the team, and thank them for getting behind our podcasts. And this will drop just before round 1 next week as part 4 of our AFL preview. And of course, you'll get it on, when I say round 1, opening round, of course, then it's round 1. It confuses the hell out of me. I don't like it, but we're going to get used to it.
Do you think they should just the last one, do you think they should call opening round 1? I've been hot on this because I think it just confuses the hell out of people.
Yes.
Yes, I do. Yep.
Ridiculous, isn't it?
Yeah, round 1, then round 2, and in the end you have 25 rounds.
Yeah, I just think, it just seems logical if that round counts, then it's round 1, even if it's unless you do a split first round like they used to, the old split rounds, you do half of round 1 and then the other half of it later. So.
Well, they used to do, I used to love that when it was the old VFL with 3 games on Saturday, 3 games on Monday, and then of course they had round 11, which was Queen's birthday weekend. Collingwood always played Melbourne. St Kilda always played Richmond. Essendon always played Hawthorn. Carlton always played the Bulldogs, generally out at the Whitten Oval. And if the Dogs were no good, they still tended to beat them out there, which was great dates. That was obviously a long time ago. South Melbourne played North Melbourne and Geelong played Fitzroy. That happened every single year. It was round 11. Then it was round 22 at the different grounds. But of course, it's so much different the way they do the draw. The draw will never be even, which is very unfortunate. But there's not much we can do about it. Appreciate your time, Damo and Darren. Of course, you can get this particular podcast on Spotify and all the various social media platforms. For everyone out there, enjoy the footy season. For those that are invested, like me, like Dash, like Damian, we are silly, but we absolutely love it. It means our weeks are going to be either ruined or be fantastic, depending on the success of our footy teams. But enjoy it, and we'll catch you again soon on Dash and Gan Sporting Adventures for KISS Professional Solutions.